Ladies and gentlemen, once again welcome to this afternoon's RSIS Distinguished Lecture by Professor Amin Saikal. It is my privilege to introduce Professor Saikal, who is Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University. Professor Saikal is Emeritus Professor of Middle Eastern and Central Asian Studies and the founding director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies, Middle East and Central Asia at the Australian National University. She is also Adjunct Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Western Australia. Professor Saikal is an awardee of the Order of Australia for service to the international community in education through the development of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies, and as an author and advisor. He is an elected Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and a winner of the Peter Baum Award, Australian National University's top award, recognizing eminent achievement and merit of the highest order. Professor Saikal is extremely well published, and in the interest of time, I will just mention his most recent book by Princeton University Press, Iran Rising, The Survival and Future of the Islamic Republic. Professor Saikal is also a frequent commentator on Australian and international media. You may have heard him recently talking about the Middle East crisis. Before I end, I would like to mention that Professor Saikal has a forthcoming new book entitled How to Lose a War, the story of America's intervention in Afghanistan, published by Yale University Press soon. There are flyers on the table, and if you're interested, please do take a copy on the way out. This afternoon, Professor Saikal has chosen to address the question whether Afghanistan under Taliban rule is an emergent global security challenge, whether it is an emergent global security challenge. Professor Saikal, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Gon. And it was very kind you to elevate me to the position that I don't deserve in academia. But first of all, I would like to really sincerely thank the Rajaratnam School of International Studies for inviting me, and especially to give this lecture on the topic of Afghanistan under Taliban rule, an emerging global security challenge. The Taliban rule of Afghanistan has not only proved disastrous for the people of the country, but also stands to pose a serious challenge to global security. Never before has a group like the erstwhile terrorist Taliban emerged anywhere in the Muslim world. Their ultra-extremist dispositions place them in a class of their own. They see themselves as God's pristine vicegerents with a mission to transform Afghanistan into a nucleus for creating God's kingdom on earth. While having inherited sufficient modern arms, including an air force, from the United States and its allies, to build a massive military force and a sizable contingent of suicide bombers, the group has systematically set out to reverse all the pro-liberalist changes that the country, that is Afghanistan, experienced during the 2-decade-long of US and Allied intervention in the country. The Taliban's return to power has certainly provided impetus for other like-minded groups, or for that matter, violent extremist groups, most importantly Al-Qaeda and RSIS, to emulate the group's success. Alarmed by these developments, the United Nations has recently issued a warning about the danger of terrorism arising from Afghanistan as a threat to global security. In today's talk, I would like to address 3 issues: the circumstances under which the Taliban succeeded in reassuming power, the nature, ideology, and governing methods of the Taliban, and the national and global security implications of the group and power. The Taliban's return to power has come against the backdrop of US failure to achieve what originally compelled it to intervene in Afghanistan. Backed by NATO and non-NATO allies, the United Nations, and indeed worldwide sympathy, the conservative Republican President George W. Bush's administration launched America's Afghanistan campaign in the wake of al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks on 11th of September 2001, primarily to achieve two intertwined objectives. One was specifically to punish the perpetrators of 9/11, and more prominently its leader Osama bin Laden, as the prime target, and their protectors, the ultra-extremist Taliban regime, and to ensure that Afghanistan was no longer a hub for terrorist groups. The other objective of the United States was to accomplish this in conflation with the wider foreign policy goals of democracy promotion and war on terrorism, as mutually reinforcing for cementing the post-Cold War position of the United States as the sole superpower and generating a post-Cold War America-centric world order. The original intention was to execute the Afghanistan campaign within a light footprint approach in a relatively short period and in a cost-effective manner, and yet an entanglement with the two broader foreign policy aims, that is, war on terrorism and democracy promotion. However, after initial military success in toppling the Taliban regime and dispersing al-Qaeda, America's Afghan campaign faced serious, unforeseen roadblocks for which the United States lacked effective contingency plans. A failure to apprehend bin Laden sooner rather than later, and to help to put Afghanistan on a democratic and anti-terror war trajectory, and to stunt Pakistan's Afghanistan ambitions in a zone of frenemies and rivalries, enmeshed America in prolonged, complex processes of state building and in fighting a robust, Pakistan-backed, Taliban-led insurgency. In this, the Bush administration's ideological and geopolitical preferences assumed greater importance over what was required to assist in shaping Afghanistan's transition based on a sound understanding of the country's historical and prevailing realities, and of course also realities of the region. From the time of the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, as an extension of the war on terrorism, the Afghanistan campaign was relegated to secondary importance. It drifted in a direction that was not originally anticipated. The United States and Allied efforts faltered in contributing effectively to Afghanistan's transformation into a stable, secure, economically viable, and self-sustaining state in a democratic and anti-terror alliance with the United States. Poor Afghan leadership, corrupt, dysfunctional governments, a state-society dichotomy, functioning to benefit more the leaders and their supporting elites than a majority of the impoverished and war-traumatized Afghan citizens, and other state-building anomalies in such areas as the opium industry, the economy, the status of women, and social services rapidly featured in Afghanistan's transition. This was accompanied by serious US strategic missteps in crucial phases of the campaign, including troop and weapon shortages, slow and inadequate training and equipping of the Afghan armed and security forces, and an indecisive policy in dealing with Pakistan. These variables generated increased opportunities for the Taliban-led insurgency to flourish and spread across the country, and for Islamabad to maintain its patronage of the insurgents until final victory. By the time Bush's democratic successor Barack Obama took office in January 2009, the Afghanistan project was in serious trouble. with any chances of a victory fading. Obama reset the U.S. strategy to Afghanize the war, to maximize pressure on Pakistan, and to pave the way for a political settlement in pursuit of a respectable military exit. But it was too late to change the realities on the ground. The specific date that President Obama set for withdrawal of most of the U.S. and allied troops by the close of 2014 changed America's approach from one of condition-based to a time-bound involvement. This development clearly signaled to the Taliban and their supporters that the end of the US-led campaign was in sight. America's assassination of bin Laden in proximity of Islamabad on 2nd of May 2011 strengthened Obama's forced drawdown resolve. However, it could not diminish Pakistan's support for the Taliban and their partners, with the aim of securing Afghanistan as a proxy state, while everything else in Afghanistan was moving in their favor. Against the backdrop of ongoing tensions and conflicts among the Afghan leaders and weaknesses of their governments, a chronic factor in the course of the historical evolution of mosaic Afghanistan, Obama's shift in strategy hardened the determination of the Taliban and their Pakistani patrons to stay on course. As the US and allied troop drawdown commenced in mid-2011, dropping from a peak of 147,000 to less than 20,000 to train and support Afghan forces by the turn of 2015, Washington in effect undercut its ability to pressure or persuade the Taliban to negotiate a viable political settlement with the governments in Kabul, which the insurgents had rejected as puppets and illegitimate. However, the Taliban were now in a stronger position than at any time to negotiate directly with the desperate US alone, largely on their terms. President Donald Trump's impulsive quest for an urgent total pullout provided them a unique opportunity. Handling of the negotiations from the US side by the Afghan-American Republican new conservative old hand, Zalmay Khalilzad, proved disastrous. Hailing from a common Pashtun heritage with the Taliban and under instruction from President Trump to facilitate a complete troop exit before the end of Trump's first term in office with the aim of partly boosting the president's re-election chances, Khalilzad's eye was always on how to fulfill the president's wishes. He found that the Taliban's deputy leader, Mullah Abdullah Ghani Brada, a reflection of what he called, Zalmay Khalilzad called, a new Taliban, who were now supposedly averse to repeating their past mistakes and the draconian rule. Hence, Khalilzad's conclusion of the infamous bilateral US-Taliban peace agreement of February 28, 2020, without the participation of the Afghan government. Under this deal, signed in Doha, Qatar, the United States gave everything to the Taliban that they wanted. In return, the Taliban agreed to a ceasefire with only the United States and allied forces until their total withdrawal within 14 months. The Taliban also pledged not to let Afghanistan be used for hostile actions against them, despite their lack of control over many parts of the country at the time. The Taliban also made a non-binding pledge to enter an intra-Afghan dialogue for a negotiated settlement. This amounted to a handover of Afghanistan to the Taliban as America's peace partner at the expense of the US alliance with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and its governments. Khalilzad had been warned by former Afghan ambassador at the UN that the signing of the agreement will prove to be disastrous. Khalilzad had been told that the deal would embolden the Taliban and their supporters to conquer the rest of the country, undermine the morale of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, and send out the wrong message to radical extremist terrorist groups in the region and around the world. But Khalilzad ignored that warning. And of course, some people claim that probably Hamas was one of those groups which was encouraged by America's defeat in Afghanistan. President Joe Biden, a long-standing critic of Afghan war, had been advised by Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley against withdrawal in view of the fragile state of the Afghan government and its military capability. President Biden nonetheless decided to go ahead and implement the Trump-era peace agreement based on a personal conviction that it was time that Afghans took care of their own security and governance, and that prolonging the U.S. intervention would not make a difference. Yet, Biden's evaluation of the situation was misplaced. The original goal of dismantling al-Qaeda and their equally terrorist Taliban protectors and ensuring that Afghanistan would never again be a stomping ground for terrorist groups was lost on President Biden. He was also misled by the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, who claimed that his government will survive the withdrawal of the American forces. But Ashraf Ghani himself was extremely unpopular in the country. And the Afghan national security and armed forces had no loyalty to somebody like Ashraf Ghani. With the Taliban's success in taking over major cities by conquering or winning over government commanders and reaching the gates of Kabul, Ghani, accompanied by some of his loyalists, fled to Dubai via Tashkent, Uzbekistan. Ghani's departure completed the collapse of his administration and security forces. It also evaporated any chance of a deal with the Taliban, as was subsequently claimed by Khalilzad in defense of his actions and the former Afghan President Hamid Karzai in exoneration of misdeed when he was in power. As America and allies undertook emergency operations to evacuate their staff, as well as many of their Afghan dependents, distressing images at Kabul airport were no less confronting and tragic than those at the end of America's Vietnam fiasco in 1975. Biden blamed the Trump administration for whatever happened, and Trump and his Republican Party condemned the Biden leadership for its catastrophic handling of the situation. Thus, a war conducted between a superpower and poor tribal forces, backed by a virtually bankrupt and deeply troubled Pakistan, ended for the United States and its allies. It typified the loss of a small war by a big power, but marked the start of another nightmare for the Afghan people. The renewed Taliban rule occurred against the backdrop of two-dimensional Afghanistan. On the one hand, the United States and its allies had helped change the country's political and developmental landscape with some visible pro-Western features. On the other, political and Islamic traditionalism, ethno-tribal diversity, social and economic disparity, injustices, widespread poverty, corruption, insecurity, and a state-society dichotomy still remain dominant in the country. As such, modern Afghanistan had endured many painful and destructive transitions since its emergence more than 2.5 centuries ago. At no point had the country evolved as more than a weak state, and in many ways primordial state with strong but differentiated micro-societies. whose vulnerabilities were compounded by its strategic crossroads, geographical location, and outside power interventionism. While lacking appropriate governance and resource-rich foundations, Afghanistan had never really been able either to stand on its own feet or to ward off successive outside actors from attempting, though unsuccessfully, to tame it according to their ideological and geopolitical preferences. Afghanistan had survived as a kind of rentier entity during most of its existence. The only period in which Afghanistan enjoyed a relative stability and peace was between 1930 and the mid-1970s. That was largely due to a certain power-based relationship arrangements that the monarchy of the time had managed to forge against the backdrop of the flexibility provided at first by a reduction in the traditional Anglo-Russian rivalry and subsequently by vagaries of the US-Soviet Cold War competition. Even so, Afghanistan had never really experienced anything like the first and second round of the Taliban rule. Taliban 2.0 has essentially weaponized Islam in accordance with their unique version of the faith, based on a Sunni Deobandi Salafist interpretation, for power and legitimacy to impose their rule, turning Afghanistan into a devastated entity. Their so-called interim government, representing mainly the Ghilzai tribe of the ethnic Pashtuns, and not all the Pashtuns, who have historically formed the largest minority in Afghanistan, has been led by erstwhile terrorist figures, most of them on the United Nations blacklist and some wanted by the US Federal Bureau of Investigation. The regime, that is the Taliban regime, has proven to be repressive, exclusionary, and discriminatory. By applying draconian edicts and laws, it has brutally stripped women and girls of all their rights, including education, work, and freedom of movement, ostracized non-Pashtun minorities, particularly the Hazaras and the Tajiks and Panjshiris, with measures that have potentially amounted to massive human rights violations and episodes of ethnic cleansing, and they've silenced any form of dissent or opposition. As foreign aid has dried up, so has the Afghan economy, banking system, social services, most importantly health and education, industrial enterprises, and employment opportunities. Many of Afghanistan's limited educated pool of people have either fled or been imprisoned or killed by the Taliban. House searches, persecution and killing of the remaining administrative and security members of the previous US-backed governments have become a common daily occurrence. So have the disappearance and flogging of women and men who have potentially or actively resisted the Taliban impositions. Afghanistan has faced the biggest humanitarian crisis in its recorded history. It has become a begging bowl of the world, with 95 to 98% of its estimated 38 to 40 million population dependent on international handouts, suffering from recorded level of hunger, death from preventable starvation, malnutrition, and disease has been rife. According to the Global Hunger Index, in 2022, Afghanistan ranked 109 out of 121 countries. The Taliban leaders have blamed the United States and its allies for Afghanistan's miserable state, while refusing to admit that their extremist nature and dispositions have been primarily responsible. The Taliban 2.0 have engaged in a kind of wholesale radical Islamization of Afghanistan that is no parallel in any other Muslim country. Most of the educational forums and institutions, including universities, have been turned into religious madrasas and seminaries. The aim is to change Afghanistan into a unique theopolitical totalitarian state. Further, this is the first time in the history of Afghanistan, and indeed that of the world, that an erstwhile terrorist group, in continued solidarity with perpetrators or the executors of 9/11, has assumed power while inheriting a massive military machine courtesy of the United States and its Afghan allies. In its disorderly and chaotic retreat, the United States left behind some $7.2 billion worth of military arsenal, including light and heavy weapons, ammunition, drones, and a fleet of jet fighters and helicopters, empowering the Taliban to build and equip a 150,000 strength defense force and a sizable brigade of suicide bombers, a means of which they had successfully deployed against the United States, its allies, and Afghan government forces, as well as civilian targets in the past. A recent report of the United Nations Analytical Support and Sanction Monitoring Team concludes, the Taliban in power as the de facto authorities in Afghanistan have reverted to exclusionary, Pashtun-centered, autocratic policies of the administration of the late 1990s. The link between the Taliban and both Al-Qaeda and Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan remains strong and symbiotic. A range of terrorist groups have greater freedom of maneuver under the Taliban de facto authorities. They are making good use of this, and the threat of terrorism is rising in both Afghanistan and the region. Pakistan initially had reason to be pleased about having achieved its long-standing goal of strategic depth, whereby it could fall back on Afghanistan in the event of another conflict with India. With the Taliban regaining power, Islamabad certainly saw an opportunity to seek Afghanistan's political, social, economic, and security integration with Pakistan. However, Islamabad failed to see that its instrumentalization of the Taliban could potentially rebound on it. The camaraderie between the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the Pakistani Taliban has lately emerged as a serious challenge to Pakistan and the region. This development is run contrary to the semi-secularist standing of Pakistan's political and military elite. Since late 2022, in addition to occasional differences with the Taliban over management of the Afghan-Pakistan border, Islamabad has voiced complaints about the Pakistani Taliban's cross-border terrorism emanating from Afghanistan, and has called on Taliban government in Kabul to stop it. Concurrently, the Taliban, all of whose leaders and commanders have lived and been trained in Pakistan, with many of them intimately linked to Pakistan's powerful military intelligence RSI, have recently relocated many Pakistani Taliban fighters to non-Pashtun provinces of Afghanistan, especially in the north. The purpose is to Pashtunize the whole of Afghanistan as the exclusive land of the Pashtuns, but this could also spell trouble for Pakistan. The longer-term danger for Pakistan lies in the possible rise of a militant Islamic Pashtun nationalism on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border in pursuit of a wider radical Islamic Afghanistan, as some Taliban leaders have touted and Al-Qaeda operatives would want. Such a development would be bound to pose a serious regional and global security danger. As former Pakistani RSI Director, General Faiz Hamid says, it has to be admitted that Pakistan-Afghan policy has failed. Meanwhile, the success or failure of America's Afghanistan project did not concern only Afghanistan, the United States, and Pakistan. America's adversaries, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Russia, and China, watched very closely the unfolding events in Afghanistan with concerns about America's motivation for wider regional and global objectives. They were wary of the process of democratization and were happy when the project eventually failed. They harvested its shortcomings and loopholes to their advantage in whatever way possible and have been pleased about America's retreat from the region. Yet, this is not where the story has ended for them. Washington has lately sought to court the Taliban so that they can control Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State of Khorasan, which is a branch of the Islamic State, and enable the United States to stir up trouble for Iran and Russia and Central Asia. In a mutual counter-move, Moscow and Beijing have pursued a modus vivendi with the Taliban, with Tehran watching the space very closely. Afghanistan has once again become a fertile ground for major power competition from which the Taliban have not failed to benefit. The Taliban totalitarian behavior has generated widespread domestic resentment and outside apprehension. Many Afghan women from the urban centers, Kabul in particular, have expressed their public opposition only to be confronted by the Taliban's repressive measures. In addition, several armed resistance groups have burgeoned. One of them is the National Resistance Front, led by Ahmad Massoud, son of the famed Afghan Mujahideen commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, who fought the Soviet occupation and the Taliban before he was assassinated by Al-Qaeda agents 2 days before 9/11. Massoud has firmly stated that the National Resistance Front's policies as embodying the aspirations of a majority of the Afghan people, in particular the younger generation, who form the bulk of the population. He and the National Resistance Front claim to stand for a just and democratic transformation of Afghanistan as a responsible, constructive, multi-ethnic, and progressive sovereign Islamic state. The National Resistance Front's leadership is based in Tajikistan, but its fighters, lately reported to number about 5,000, have been battling the Taliban in hit-and-run guerrilla operations in several northern and northeastern provinces of Afghanistan. Its fighters originate mostly from those areas and include some members of the special forces of the former administration trained by the United States and its allies. However, neither the National Resistance Front nor any other resistance forces, such as the Afghanistan Freedom Front and the Afghanistan Islamic National and Liberation Movement, are at this stage materially backed by any outside power. They lack sufficient capability and unity to debase the Taliban quickly. The fight is expected to be long and arduous. In fact, the leader of the National Resistance Front, Ahmad Massoud, had just been visiting France and the European Union at the invitation of the European Union, but we really don't know what's likely to come out of that. The Taliban are not a united entity either. They are divided along hardline, moderate, and opportunist lines. The Haqqani group, led by Sirajuddin Haqqani, hailing mostly from eastern Afghanistan, is not entirely in with the core Taliban group emanating from Kandahar in the south, who include Mullah brother and Defense Minister Mullah Muhammad Yaqub, son of Mullah Muhammad Omar, the former leader of the Taliban, or the founder of the Taliban. The Haqqani leaders, who are very much in control of Kabul and the eastern provinces, have voiced occasional dissatisfaction with the Kandahar-based hardline leadership of Mullah Ubaidullah Akhundzadeh, who has been as reclusive as his predecessor, Mullah Omar. In all, the Taliban's rule and the interests of their Pakistani supporters are not based on enduring foundations. Let me conclude. If Afghanistan's history and the United States intervention tells us one thing, it is that no single group, with or without the support of an outside player, can succeed in creating the necessary conditions for modern statehood in the country. Only a multi-ethnically popular-based coalition stands a chance to move the country forward to stability, security, prosperity, and national unity. The Taliban's rule by force and politics of exclusivity and ethno-tribal supremacy cannot be expected to succeed. How long will it last? That would depend on the extent of internal resistance and external pressure. For the time being, Afghanistan has a serious risk of becoming a terrorist nest under the Taliban, where in addition to Al-Qaeda, the hostile Islamic State of Khorasan has also found fertile grounds. It is lately reported that the Taliban and the Islamic State of Khorasan have reached a deal not to attack each other. While Afghanistan's future hangs in the balance, the Taliban empowerment has certainly widened the arena for violent extremist forces as a source of threat to global security. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We now invite questions and comments from the audience. Please introduce yourself. Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi, Prof. Saikal. Thank you very much for your great presentation. Just a question regarding Chinese interests and business interests in Afghanistan. Given the allegations and rumors that ISKP has been targeting Chinese businessmen, assets, and interests in Afghanistan, what extent do you think that the Taliban government will go to protect such assets or individuals in Afghanistan? Would they go into conflict with ISKP over such an issue in order to protect their foreign relations?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. China is very much interested in the natural resources of Afghanistan. And there's plenty of them which remain untapped in a lot of ways. At one point, it was predicted that the mineral resources of Afghanistan buried under the soil of the country would amount to something like $3 trillion. Perhaps it might have been a little bit exaggerated, but nonetheless, there is considerable amount of resources. And that's one of the important reasons that China has strengthened relations or established relations with the Taliban. And of course, they've sent out an ambassador to Taliban regime without recognizing the regime. But China is also, in a number of Chinese companies have already signed, at least as far as I'm aware, 10 contracts for exploiting different resources of the country. But it might be a little bit premature to claim that China is going to really succeed, because the repressive rule of the Taliban has already generated considerable amount of resentment from inside Afghanistan, and of course armed opposition. So that means that there are chances of conflict really growing inside Afghanistan will not provide a degree of stability that either China could exploit these resources, or for that matter, the Taliban could provide the degree of security which the Chinese investment really needs in the country. But for the time being, also China is very much interested in competing with other powers in Afghanistan. Let's not really forget that China has a strategic partnership with Pakistan, and it is very much involved in the Pakistan, China-Pakistan economic corridor as part of the Belt and Road initiatives. And of course, they would like to really also exploit the Afghanistan route to the extent that was necessary in order to materialize the Belt and Road extension to West Asia, and then from there to Europe, and of course then through Morocco to Africa. So it's part of the whole thing. That's why I think that the Chinese are also very much interested in the country. In the meantime, as I pointed out in my talk, the Pakistan support of the Taliban has backfired in a lot of ways. I mean, now we see that actually the Taliban have forged very close ties with the Pakistani Taliban, and the Pakistani government has been complaining that there's been cross-border terrorism from Afghanistan. And of course, Pakistan has got its own massive domestic problems. And it is in many ways a fairly fragile state. So I think the situation at the moment remains quite really cloudy. Where is that going to lead? Russia has also taken a great deal of interest in Afghanistan. In fact, Russia just had the Afghanistan format meeting in Moscow, to which they invited Taliban. And also, Russia has given the Afghan embassy to the Taliban in Moscow, but has not really recognized the Taliban. And their aim also is to how to ensure that America does not really succeed in forging some sort of a close relationship with the Taliban as an anti-Chinese and anti-Russian force. So Afghanistan used to be the victim of the great game of the late 19th century, second half of the 19th century, and early 20th century. And then it became sort of sandwiched in the global Cold War. The Afghan leaderships exploited that to the benefit of Afghanistan. They got aid from both sides. But now, once again, that old great game has come into a sort of become a modern great game, and Afghanistan is the subject of it. You might really ask, why the world is so much interested in Afghanistan? It's apart from these mineral resources which have not been exploited, Afghanistan doesn't have much more to offer to the world. Has never been in a position to offer a lot to the world, in terms of trained manpower, in terms of the industries, in terms of productivity, that sort of thing. It is really the geographical location of Afghanistan that is really connects Central Asia to West Asia, to South Asia, and to the Far East through the short border with China. And so that's the reason that Afghanistan has historically become the highway of conquest. All the forces which are coming from the different direction, they have to go through Afghanistan. And somehow they've tried to subdue Afghanistan and try to reshape the country according to their ideological and geopolitical preferences, but at the end, they have not really succeeded. The British didn't succeed, the Soviets didn't succeed, and the Americans failed.
Next question. Professor Rohan, and then after that, I can't see
Professor Amin Saikal, you are one of the preeminent specialists on Afghanistan. As a long-term observer of Afghanistan, I would have expected you to give us a blueprint on how to engage the Taliban. But you have, on the contrary, given an assessment that will please the international security community on how to contain, disrupt and degrade the Taliban, which I don't think will happen in the short term. So I would like to ask you two questions. One is, let's pierce to the future. In the last 72 hours, Taliban and its ally, Al-Qaeda, because it's not only the return of the Taliban, it's the return of Taliban-Al-Qaeda alliance. They have issued statements asking the neighboring countries of Israel to permit the foreign fighters to enter the theater of battle. You did not focus on it. You only made a very short reference that Hamas may have been inspired by Taliban. I would have expected you to present and focus more on the future, because you have the depth of history, so you can go and look at what is going to happen. Second question is, you didn't touch on the drugs. As I look at the drug trade, both the plant-based drugs, cocaine and heroin, has severe competition from synthetic drugs, but still the production of plant-based drugs appeal tremendously. And we have seen the movement of drugs, both Afghan heroin, through Pakistan and Iran, on the Iranian dhows, through the Indian Ocean, with the drug coordinators in the Gulf, west of the Maldives, Sri Lanka, coming even up to the Southeast Asian region. So I would like you to touch on drugs. But mostly I want to congratulate you for taking on the Taliban when other scholars have failed, and publicly continuing to speak about the brutal regime of Taliban. But I would differ with you, because I would want to engage Taliban. Like you, I also was in Afghanistan many times, 12 times. But I think that we have to work with them, because Western countries have no appetite to fight the Taliban anymore. They have been defeated. It is not a Western retreat. It is a Western defeat. Not only of Afghanistan, but of Iraq, but also of Syria, but also of Lebanon, also of Libya, also of Somalia. I don't think the Western armies, the finest armies in the world, today have the staying power to remain and fight in these conflict zones. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rohan, and it's very nice to see you in very good shape. I've known Rohan for a long time, and I always benefited from his knowledge and in-depth understanding of some of the very complex issues. About the future, I think there was a report that, yes, the Taliban had asked Afghanistan's neighbors to allow them to cross their land and go fight in support of Hamas. But I've been told that that's fake news. It's not really substantiated. There's a lot of things coming through the social media at the moment. I think the Taliban will be, at this point, more inward-looking rather than looking to the outside complications or involvements. I don't think they want to really do that. On the issue of whether we should really take on the Taliban or engage the Taliban, there's a lot of debate going on about that. And you're absolutely right that there is no appetite on the part of the Western countries or many members of the international community to take on the Taliban. My point is that no, the resistance will emerge from within Afghanistan. Let's not forget, Rohan, that since 1973, 5 ideological groups have come from different parts of the political spectrum, have come to power in Afghanistan, and they've lost power in Afghanistan. This has all happened over a very short period of time. No other country has experienced that much change as Afghanistan has. To have been from 1973 to 2023, to have something like about, or 2021, to have 5 different groups coming, assuming power, and losing power. So it's very difficult to be very firm in our predictions what is likely to happen in Afghanistan. But my feeling is that the internal resistance would gather momentum. And the Taliban do not have the necessary resources and skills to be able to govern a country which has changed considerably over the last 2 decades under the America's watch. And I think that it does. On the issue, and when I say that internal resistance, but of course that will be, it will be really helped if there is external pressure, not internal. In fact, Ahmad Nassoud, in his speech at the European Union Parliament, said, we don't need help from outside. We don't need material help. We don't need armament. What we need is sort of a political support in keeping the pressure on Taliban. That's what we really want. So a combination of internal resistance and outside pressure without any outside powers, military involvement in Afghanistan, over a period of time, is going to really weaken the position of the Taliban. And they are divided among themselves. And you can see once they are sort of weakened, then the divisions from within, from amongst the Taliban, will emerge. On the issue of drugs, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Taliban leader declared the cultivation of poppy banned. But from all the reports that we receive, that's not really the case. It is such a lucrative trade and lucrative source of income that the Taliban would not be able to do without it. And yes, that is a major concern. In fact, the Russians have already raised their concerns about that because a considerable amount of drugs are sort of channeled through Afghanistan to Central Asia, and then from Central Asia to Russia, and then they find their way onto the streets of Europe. That's what's really happening. So that is something that the European countries will have to really consider. And how long that's really going to continue, and how that is really going to affect the European societies, and perhaps eventually the United States and so on. So, but you're absolutely right that that's another major issue. Thank you.
The lady in the third row, after that. Yes, you raised your hand, right? Yes, yes. 1, 2, 3, third row.
Thank you, Professor Saikal, for a very broad overview of Afghanistan under Taliban. With all due respect, I would like to disagree that Afghanistan's importance lies only in its geostrategic location. There is immense potential in the human resource that they have, which is untapped. Recently, Singapore has just concluded an international robotics competition. And as you know, the all-female robotics team have been competing since 2017. And they always had a very decent finishing amongst other more resourceful and established countries. So under the backdrop of the fourth industrial revolution, the impending fourth industrial revolution, and defense technologies, etc., the skills that they possess actually have a lot of currency. So I'd like to know what is your view as to why the Taliban is not nurturing and supporting the potential of half of their population, especially in STEM education. Thank you.
I'm sorry, the question was why the Taliban?
Why the Taliban is neglecting 1/2 of their population, which is the female population, especially in STEM skills.
Yes. I mean, that's a very, very good question. So the Taliban has brought in something which hadn't existed before in the vocabulary of the international law and international community. That's gender apartheid. They claim that this is what Islam prescribes. But there is absolutely nothing in Islam which forbids women from acquiring education, forbids women from working, participating in societal building. There's nothing in Islam. I'm a Muslim. I have studied the Quran. I have studied the hadiths of the Prophet, the sayings of the Prophet. There is absolutely nothing. If anything, there is a Quranic verse which basically says that you must acquire knowledge even as far as China. which is sort of a metaphor that's using. So there's absolutely nothing. But these people have come up with an interpretation and application of Islam which just simply do not exist. Why are they really doing that? They're doing that because they have to have a target in order to keep their own movement together, in order to polarize the society and take advantage of that polarization of the society to their political advantage. I mean, beyond that, I don't have any other explanation that why they are really doing that, because it is not Islamic. But what they are really doing is saying that no, it is Islamic, and this is what the Sharia prescribes, and therefore we must really do this. But my feeling is that there's some division. There is also moderate, if you can call it, moderate elements among the Taliban, and particularly in the Haqqani network, that they would like to really see the woman, education and work and participation in society, in the social life of the society coming back. They would like to, but at the moment they are just basically trying to maintain their own unity, so that their own divisions, internal divisions, would not open up, will not really come to the surface. So I think that is the main reason. But also they want to use this gender apartheid as a bargaining chip with the international community. You give us recognition, and in return we will reduce our restrictions on women, on girls, and so on. And from my point of view, it's very important that the international community doesn't fall for that.
This, and then after that you, and then after that. Okay? Yes.
I'm sorry, there's no such a thing as short answers.
It's okay. It's okay. Very
Thank you so much. Professor Saikal, always an amazing experience to listen to you. 9/11 happened some 23 years ago, and US invaded Afghanistan, and we all know the fate of it. Then you wrote a book, How to Lose a War, which has not yet come in the market. Just a few days ago, 9/11 happened for Israel. Now it's invading Gaza, chasing Hamas. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in that book for Israel. Wouldn't you consider sending an advance copy of your book to Mr. Netanyahu? Thank you.
You know, when my book came out by Princeton University Press, this is a long time ago, The Rise and Fall of the Shah, Professor Richard Falk, who is at Princeton University, went to meet Ayatollah Khomeini. He took 3 copies with him. He gave 1 copy to Ayatollah Khomeini, but of course it was in English, and they gave another copy to Bani Sadr, the first elected president of Iran, and a 3rd copy he gave to, I think, to Yasser Arafat in Beirut. It didn't have any effect on any of them. I would be very surprised if the forthcoming book, How to Lose a War, the story of American intervention in Afghanistan, will have any impact on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Somebody, I had a discussion with a friend not very long ago, and they were asking me about the Taliban, and this person said, yeah, Afghanistan has got its Taliban, and Israel has its own Taliban as well. And they are the religious extremists that have found their way into Netanyahu's cabinet. And they are the ones that were totally opposed to Palestinians and would like the total annexation of the West Bank and even Gaza Strip. In other words, a land of Israel from river to river. I mean, that is what is really they want. And of course, that may well have also contributed the current crisis that has beset the region, this tragic fight between Hamas and Israel at the detriment of a lot of innocent people from both sides. That's what's really happening. So I wouldn't really encourage the Yale University Press to send a copy to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, provided that he's still in power. Because what has really happened and what Hamas has done has shown the vulnerability of Prime Minister Netanyahu as a security provider to his own people. When the dust settles down, the political knives will be out. There will be a lot of questions which will be raised. And I think Netanyahu is going to be in a very vulnerable position. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Prof. One question that I have is the second part of your title. So are Taliban an emerging global security challenge, if you could reflect on that? The second one is on these contrasting views about Al-Qaeda and ISKP. For instance, one view is that Al-Qaeda is in Al-Qaeda Central in Afghanistan is in a terminal decline. The other view, talking to people in Afghanistan, other places, say no, they are being ideologically rehabilitated, and they have started preaching while building their operational linkages. So what's your view on Al-Qaeda? Same goes for ISKP. Some people say the threat is over-exaggerated. The others say it is underestimated. It's more of a regional threat. It is a franchise of ISK, but really an Afghanistan-Pakistan phenomena. Lastly, what Professor Rohan said, we'll have to engage with the Taliban. What are our matrices, frameworks, or models? Is it the Hezbollah model? They have a militant wing, but they participated in politics and moved partially towards democracy. You talked about Hamas winning election in 2005-06. What happened to them? Is it the Brotherhood model? Where do you start engaging? Of course, there are some moderate elements there. How do you start the dialogue on that level? For at least somewhere they start opening up towards mainstream politics, democracy. What comes to your mind? You have done so much on Middle East. How do you start that? And can something be achieved from there, that process, or will it be a waste of time? Thanks, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Abdul Basit, for those very penetrating questions, and I don't know whether I can provide adequate answers to each one of them. But on the issue of a threat to global security, I think we know that Taliban is still very much organically linked to Al-Qaeda. Of course, their rival to Islamic State of Khorasan, and lately there have been reports that they may have reached some sort of understanding, not to attack one another, and probably also, the Chinese factor come into consideration in that respect, and so on, and the investment that China makes in the country and all those sort of things. But the other thing is that the triumph of the Taliban has become an important source of encouragement to many like-minded groups around the world. The perception is that if the Taliban can defeat a world power like the United States, and not only that, but as NATO allies, which is supposed to be the world's most powerful military alliance, and if they can defeat them, why we cannot really defeat our corrupt, unelected, authoritarian governments? And some people have already, in the social media, not in the mainstream media, have raised the issue or the question of how much, for example, Hamas has been encouraged by that sort of thinking. This not to claim that Hamas has just planned the whole thing yesterday or the day before. It's taken over a considerable amount of time, that sort of planning. But then again, Taliban has now been in power for more than 2 years, in Afghanistan. So it is in that sense, and that basically emboldening these other extremist groups, whether it is in Southeast Asia, whether it's in the Philippines, or whether it's in South Asia, or for that matter, whether it's in the Middle East, or possibly Horn of Africa. You've got the Al-Shabaab, you've got the Boko Haram in Africa, in all these sort of groups. And of course, you've got the Al-Qaeda branch in Yemen, you've got the Al-Qaeda branch in North Africa. I mean, it is in that sense that it potentially poses a threat to global security. On the issue of whether, I think, which was a very good question Rohan raised, and you sort of also reinforced it. I think at this stage it's going to be extremely difficult to reach out to the Taliban, simply because that the policies that they're pursuing, they are immoral, unethical, and impractical. And therefore, it would be a moral bankruptcy on the part of any force from outside Afghanistan to approach the Taliban for improved standing or relations while the group is still practicing gender apartheid, ethnic discrimination, ethnic supremacy, and so on. Yes, if the Taliban change course to some extent, and you do give a very clear indication that they are in favor of creating an inclusive government, they are prepared to drop this discrimination against women, against minorities, other minorities, then I think that will be the time that certain forces could reach out to the Taliban and say, okay, look, but Qataris has been trying very hard in the last 2 years, and they have not been successful. And it's also a real back down for the Taliban now to say, yes, we're going to drop all this. But they want something in return. And the return is, we want international recognition. So it's becoming a sort of a chicken and egg. Which one is going to come first? But I think it will have to really come first from the Taliban.
There's a question over there, right? Oh, yes, please. Yes.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the talk. It was illuminating and widespread, wide coverage. I think it's quite useful to also acknowledge the suffering of the Afghan people and hope that they are able to achieve their legitimate aspirations in the future. My question, I think, is threefold. First, if I understood correctly, the argument is that the Taliban, through their success, acts as a magnet for other groups that may be interested in, that may share similar ideologies, and hence such groups may use Afghanistan either as an inspiration or as a source of training or source of support for their own movements in their own countries. The first part of this question is given that this is similar to what happened between 1996 and 2001, is it likely that the Taliban may be cautious about taking on such a role in case they invite another intervention in the future? So that's point one. Point two, is the Taliban ideology itself a compelling one for the region other than in Pakistan? Does the ethno-supremacy of the Taliban approach strike any chords in the neighboring countries other than Pakistan? So for example, in Iran or Uzbekistan, etc., given the different ethnic composition or religious composition. And the third, now that the Taliban has been in power for 2 years, and I think is facing the actual challenges of governance. Do you think that objective reality may over time impose a certain level of moderation? Because it's very easy to say and parrot slogans or even to fight, but it's a very different thing to govern.
Yeah, thank you very much. Answering each one of your questions probably will take a very long time, but let me just be very, very brief. I think on the issue of the Taliban becomes a magnet, for other forces. I think time obviously is going to tell us, how that's going to evolve. I mean, at this stage, my understanding is that Al-Qaeda has established a basis in at least half of Afghanistan 32 provinces. And then, as you know, that the leader of Al-Qaeda, the former leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was targeted by the Americans in Kabul. I mean, in other words, the presence of the Al-Qaeda leader in Kabul, that in itself really told us a great deal about the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Of course, the Taliban have repeatedly said that we are not going to allow Afghanistan soil to be used against Afghanistan's neighbors and so on. But my understanding is just 2 weeks ago that a couple of Taliban had crossed the border into Tajikistan. And they were caught, and I think they were captured by the Tajik security forces. And I think in the gun battle, both of them, well, they're not really captured in the gun battle, both of them were killed. I think there is also danger of the Uzbek opposition, Islamic opposition. I mean, there are reports that they are based in northern Afghanistan. Uzbekistan has been trying to reach out to the Taliban as much as possible, but at the same time, there are concerns in Central Asia that this Taliban success in Afghanistan may metastasize and really influence the situation in Central Asia. So I think as a source of inspiration and also as a force of material support, the Taliban are in a fairly strong position. I mean, as I pointed out, Taliban has inherited $7.2 billion worth of arms. I mean, light and heavy arms as well as air force and all these sort of things. And in the last couple of years, I mean, Pakistan has been very helpful to them. I mean, in fact, Imran Khan, when he was in power, he issued an order that the skilled Pakistani labor could go to Afghanistan in order to help the administration of the Taliban. On the issue of whether sort of ideologically the Taliban will sort of, because they're facing so much problems of governance and they really don't have the skilled manpower and the trained manpower and all these sort of things, and then confronting these challenges will eventually really help them moderate. Well, so far there's no indication of that whatsoever. In fact, they are harder this time than they were between 1996 and 2001. But of course, now they've also inherited a more sophisticated landscape because the United States and its allies made so much investment, not in the Afghan security forces and Afghan politics and this and that, which at the end really didn't work, but also infrastructural development of Afghanistan. I mean, they've made a lot of investments. So Afghanistan, they've inherited that really totally different Afghanistan. But so far, they have absolutely shown no indication whatsoever. I mean, they've been very, very single-minded, and they've stayed on course, and but much in a harder fashion than was really even previously the case. I think there was also there was one question. Yeah, well, I mean, yes, I mean, the Taliban ideology, I would be very surprised if that really happens, because it is it's very, very unique. And it is, some people might say it is so boutique that probably others could not really possibly, given their conditions of their localities, would be able to adopt the Taliban approach. But what they do, emulate the Taliban, and that is that how the Taliban managed to return to power, how they succeeded in forcing a world power and its allies to retreat from the country. That is, I think, the model that they will be studying, be watching, and to see whether that model could really fit in their own ideological and pragmatic paradigms that they want to pursue.
I'm afraid this will be the last question.
Good afternoon, sir. It's really a privilege to hear you, as well as Professor Rohan. I'm your great fan, but this is the first time seeing you in person. Now, as you shared this afternoon, about Taliban's aspiration to transform Afghanistan into a kingdom of God, I had mixed emotions. Personally, two stories have happened in the course of this first few weeks. One, my mother, who left Sri Lanka and came down to Singapore. And in this course of this year, few years in the early 1980s, I lost, or shall I say, two of my nephews disappeared under the regime of Tamil Tigers.
And the regime of who?
Tamil Tigers. So up till today, we do not know whether they are alive or dead. Second, 7th October, when Israel decided to go into war with Palestine, I didn't really shrug much of my shoulder, and I said, okay, this is very far away, and for which I always feel so guilty, because as a teacher, so I'm a teacher in character and citizenship education, didn't really pay much attention to things happening around and says, that's very far away, until my sister-in-law called and said that my nephew has been conscripted to fight the war in Hamas, because my sister-in-law is married to an Israeli. And of course, as someone that's close, the first thing we want is come back. And of course, with the son there, who has been conscripted, she remains there. So when I hear all these things, my question to you is that as a role that I play as a teacher, and when I read the recent Singapore Terrorism Threat Assessment Report 2023, it highlighted the continuing concern with youth radicalization in Singapore. My question then is, as a teacher, what can I do to protect the youth? Because when you shared about Taliban's aspiration, this sounds pretty exciting to our youth. And youth today are being radicalized as young as 13. And these are the group of students that I work with.
Could you ask your question, because we are running out of time?
So what can we do as teachers? That's my question.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And of course, you've got the most important job, to basically educating the young minds. I think the important is that you will have to be very objective, in explaining some of these very complex issues in a language that the kids can really understand, and discern it in ways which would not really lead them towards any form of extremism, in one form or another. One of the professors at RSIS, who's now the dean at RSIS, Professor Kumar Ramakrishna, published a book last year which was called The Extremist Islam. And he has actually towards, at the end, a chapter precisely about the question that you asked, that what we should really do and what should also the parents should do and what should the teachers should do in terms of educating the young minds in this country and elsewhere. I think I would strongly recommend that if you get a copy of that and have a really look at that, because he does provide some important prescriptions in that respect. Thank you.
And on that note, it leaves me to thank Professor Amin Saikal for his sharing with us his analysis of Afghanistan, especially the answers during the Q&A, and to thank all of you for spending this afternoon with us. Thank you, and have a good evening.